Good afternoon, and welcome to the Concord Bookshop. Those of you who subscribe to the Concord Journal are no doubt familiar with the writings of Jim Leahy. While the book is entitled Living in Concord, it encompasses not only life in Concord, but growing up in England, vegetarianism, gardening, Thanksgiving dinners without the turkey, poetry, and even a recipe for a healthy Christmas pudding. I wrote a little note to myself saying oxymoron, but I'll try that later and see whether it actually works. Jim, a resident of Concord for over 30 years, is the manager of Deborah's Natural Gourmet in West Concord, works in his garden, and continues to write essays and poetry about life in Concord and beyond. So please welcome Jim Leahy.
Thank you. I forgot, Bert, that you were going to introduce me, so the first thing I was going to do was introduce myself. So I'll pass over that, since everybody knows me anyway. I guess I was going to talk about the process of writing this book for me and how I started writing it, and read a couple of selections from it, because in some ways the book is sort of divided between two somewhat different elements that I found had some common strands. I actually started writing for the Concord Journal about 10 years ago, and I started the series of columns. I sort of came into my own voice, as it were, about 3 years into the process. I started writing because I like writing, and I had some little axes to grind in terms of business and being in independent local stores here, and I thought, well, I'll grind them in the Concord Journal. And I wrote them, and they were well enough received by the editor and by others that I thought, oh, this is sort of fun. And in the process of writing one, I came up with the idea of writing about local people. So I started a series, which I did for about 3 years, of writing about local people, partly because I didn't have a sense of particularly having anything to say, and that therefore I could talk to other people who had something to say, and then I could enjoy doing the process of writing about it. And somewhere in the process, and I also think, I believe, well, the journal doesn't want just some other guy who says, oh, I can write for you, I can throw my opinion into the hat with everybody else's. So I sort of felt like I had to sell them on a concept. Whether I was right or not, I don't know, but they liked the concept. But somewhere in the process, I found that I started to want to write some of my own thoughts and feelings and experiences, and I also felt that writing in the paper, for me, I'm not terribly interested in putting my opinion out along with everybody else's, and what seemed meaningful to me was write about experience. And in some ways, I think opinions are have more of the opportunity to divide us, and experiences the opportunity to bring us together. So I like to try to write about my experience of life, and my experience of life in town and where I've come from. The columns were all written as individual pieces, and it's a very interesting thing, because when you write individual pieces for a newspaper and you're not a well-known name and therefore can't trust that people are going to read you avidly and remember you from 1 month to the next, you constantly have to, you can't, unlike in writing a book, as I discovered when I thought about writing this as a book, I thought, oh, I kind of repeat myself a lot, because I have to constantly, I can't assume that a reference to a previous column will be remembered 6 months later. Whereas if you write it in a book, you can hope that your reader pays sufficient attention in chapter 1. By chapter 3, they haven't forgotten your name and who the people you're writing about are. And that was an interesting process, making the transition, because it did a little bit of editing in order to take those out. So I found myself just writing things that meant something to me in the process of being alive. And I think the very first story in the book was one of the first columns I wrote, and I had the pleasant surprise when I first started putting the book together of expecting that I would pick up the early ones and say, well, I'll have to get rid of those. I was, that was when I was still learning what I was doing, but in fact I found I was enjoying the early things as much as the later ones. And I started just writing about gardening, because my wife Diane and I, it's one of the things that we do together. It's one of the harmonies of our life, I think Diane is a more natural gardener than I am, and one of my involvements in it is photography and writing about it, and it sort of brings me into the process in a way that sort of engages my mind even more. So I started to find that when you look at the garden, when you spend time in the garden and when you look at the garden, you get to see a metaphor of life in front of you. You get to see particularly living things have cycles and changes and have their seasons and their time of birth and death. And it's all happening in a much more concentrated way. So I found that it was interesting for me to look at the garden and think about life and passing and people I cared about, and how the garden sort of becomes a metaphor for hope and memory and all that. So I found that I was just writing about those kinds of themes. That was what moved me. It's not the only thing I think about in life, but it seemed like the thing that I think about that felt worthy of words, or that I felt I had words to express in a way that I enjoyed. So the main themes that I've had throughout the book easily divided themselves into two elements, and the first element really was when I started. The first story I wrote was about crocuses, then I was writing about daylilies because I find them an interesting species in and of themselves, and because we grow a lot of daffodils at home, the idea of daffodil bulbs in springtime and so forth. The main themes I guess I found myself constantly going on were passage, aging, love and loss, family, community, and I think living in Concord has sort of come to mean that. For me, it's living in the Concord of that as well as the town of Concord. So I picked as a first piece to read something that I picked mainly because it was seasonal. I was looking through to find something that I felt suitably represented what I've written. And this is just a short piece I called Travelers All, and it was written just about this time of year, in February of 2001. The rising sun, start that again. The rising sun streamed in through the back window of the car as I headed west on Route 2 a few weeks ago on my way to work. Ahead in the opposite sky, I watched the full wolf moon of February, simultaneously sliding towards the snowy western horizon. The last time I was paying sufficient attention to observe this phenomenon of moon and sun rising and setting in opposite skies was last October. I was in Boston with an hour to spend before meeting Diane to come home to Concord. Perhaps when I was younger I would have thought of it as an hour to kill. At this time in my life, and on this occasion, I thought of it as an hour to savor. It was the balmy evening of an Indian summer day, and being one of the legion of midlife men with back problems, I decided to drive over to Castle Island, lie on the beach, and perform my all-important back exercises under the warming glow of the sunset. I parked the car in the lot and wended my way to a remote spot where I thought my performance would be as inconspicuous as possible. Stretched out with my back pressed firmly into the warm and gravelly sand, my feet pointed back across the bay towards the Boston skyline, I waved, lifted, rotated, and otherwise extended my limbs in various therapeutic ways, then rested a moment as I prepared to do the sit-ups. Unconsciously, I had positioned myself so perfectly, legs bent and slightly apart, that when I pulled my upper body up from the ground, I was greeted by the setting sun framed precisely between my knees. The warm earth supporting me, the solar glow on my face, the unexpected serendipity of this moment took my breath away. I lingered until the sun slipped behind the buildings of South Boston. I was still basking in some feeling of connectedness when I rose to make my way back toward the car and into town. Turning round from the bay, I saw the calm waters of Boston Harbor stretching out towards the open ocean, and in the eastern sky, the full moon rising. The hunter's moon, I believe it must have been, which lingers like the harvest moon in our equinoctial sky, giving a welcome extra light to hunters or farmers, whichever the case may be, in the waning days of summer. Overhead, the glint of an underbelly of a plane flashed as it spread westward, chasing the sunset. Most of the flights to Europe were also preparing to cross the Atlantic, where they would in a few hours be speeding into an accelerating sunrise, carrying their passengers across space and time. Earlier in the summer, Diane and I had stood on the island and watched one of the last of the tall ships gliding past us, as it carried its crew of sailors, young and old, on a voyage across the seas. Riding on the tide pulled by this moon of ours, it slipped out beyond the outer harbour as we stood and watched and waved. The ground, so firm beneath our feet, all the while rotated, revolved, and hurtled through space in its continuation of the flight from the Big Bang. So last month, watching the moon set as the sun climbed behind me, I was struck by the sensation of symmetry. Winter framed between these personal celestial observations. Our New England winter, such as we had not seen in a few years, is beginning to lose its grip, even if it is still occasionally able to muster a few sharp blasts before departing. Our ice dams have melted and finally drained away in the warm days of a late February thaw. The ground, which we have not seen since before the dark days of solstice, has peeked out, if only briefly, from beneath its snowy cover. Even a March blizzard lacks the tenacity of midwinter snows and freezes. This week's full moon will once again be an equinoctial moon, as we will have passed almost halfway round the sun since that October day. The light of early March is now equal to the light of October, although the balmy warmth is yet a while off. We have already looked out our front window, hoping to see the first snowdrop heralding oncoming spring. In the sun trap under our front porch, the first tips of Iris reticulata have broken through the ground. Invisible under the snow, beneath the linden tree, crocuses are forcing their way upward. The groundhog's shadow is shortening. The 130th New England Spring Flower Show beckons in a matter of weeks. Even in the dark interior of a Boston exposition center, the feel of grass blades between one's fingers, the scent of rhododendron and azalea, the bright bursts of color which dance before eyes hungry from winter's grayness, will pull us round the circle as we move from season to season, moon to moon, sunrise to sunrise, 1 year, 1 month, 1 day, 1 moment at a time. I think one of the things that always is interesting to me is to look at the little interesting juxtapositions and coincidences in life. And I think that was one of those stories that sort of caught my imagination when I was there, thinking about at the beginning of the winter having one experience, and pretty much at the very end of the next equinox having, instead of the moon rising and the sun setting and the moon rising, it was the reverse. And it was just an experience that just, it spoke to me, asked me to write it. I found in the process of writing, you kind of learn a little about yourself when you read what you write. Sometimes you don't know what you're writing. Sometimes other people tell you what you're writing, or they tell you what it means to them, and you think, well, gee, that's, do I take credit for that? Is that coincidence? But it's, I've found, only recently I noticed that I like to quote other writers because I feel so often that I read things that say things so much better than I can, and I want to be able to write something as well in my book, and so I'll include their words. And I found it was rather interesting that I thought, oh, everybody I quote is a person from English literature, even though I read a little more widely than that, but I found it was just interesting that I was always drawn to take a Shakespeare quote, or a Virginia Woolf quote, or Yeats quote, or George Eliot, or Kenneth Graham, that somehow they all came out of my own heritage, and I think there's something about the voice that speaks to me. I have had one other influence that I feel like talking about, because a story that meant a great deal to me, and which I think has had an effect on what I've written, is a story written by Wendell Berry called The Boundary. It's a short story in a collection called The Wild Birds. I think that's actually out of print now, but it's in his wider collected stories. And it was just one of the most moving stories about memory and community. An old man walking along the boundary of his farm in Kentucky, remembering people who had died, thinking about his life, thinking about his wife waiting up in the farm, just feeling connected to the simplicity of his life there. And I think that has been of great encouragement to me to write about the simplicity of community and life and simple values. So I'm going to jump a little bit ahead. I decided that this would be a book in 2004. About halfway into the process, these were just columns with no thought of a book. And it was actually Glenn Rifkin who did published his book called Thoreau's Backyard, which was also a compilation of columns from the Concord Journal, that made me realize, oh, this is possible. Perhaps I could do something like this too. And after that, it changed a little bit, because now I was writing conscious of the fact that I was writing for a book. I wasn't just writing columns thinking they're complete throwaways. Every time I wrote, I thought, oh, I want this in my book, or I want to write this so it will be of the quality that I want in my book. So it instead of just writing to a deadline or writing something that I could throw away later or forget about, I always felt like I wanted to write things to save. And I found myself constantly drawn to certain images and certain stories. And one of the, some of the images that that recur here are growing daffodils. One time I remember reading that a daffodil bulb has a tiny, perfectly formed flower inside it before it begins its season, which was something I didn't know. And I thought that was just just a great image for me, the idea of something ready there to bud, just as I think about myself or a person as being a whole person that's sort of ready to come into flower in the process of their life. I like to write about daylilies because they have part of this interesting juxtaposition of being something that's a perennial, that's incredibly hardy, but it dies every day. Its flowers die every day and renew every day. Those kinds of paradoxes I feel are expressive of a lot of our condition. So I started to write the book, to continue to write, and in 2006 I talked to David Stark, who's the brother of Deborah at Deborah's Natural Gourmet, who is also a graphic designer and has done some book design, and he told me how to go about this process. And the process was an interesting one, because the first thing I did was decide that I had to get all the material organized and then sort of go into the design process. And when you start to organize all your material, there's a way I would not do it again, which is to look at all the stuff you don't like too much so you can start weeding it out. And after you've done that, you're so depressed with everything you've written that you feel like giving up. You go, I didn't write anything worth writing, and I only looked at all the things I didn't like and all the things I was doubtful about. And it was a pretty miserable experience. At the end of the day, I wondered, why was I doing this? And then I put it away, and I came back a few days later. I thought, well, I'll read the things I like. Maybe that will encourage me. And I read them, and I was just very pleasantly surprised, and probably all the more so for having thought of myself as in very poor shape only 2 days before. In discovering myself as a writer, I found that I was always writing about here and there. I was writing about England, and I was writing about Concord. And so when I started to put the book together, at first I thought, will this make a book? And the way it made a book for me, and the way it made sense, was to start putting those stories together, because I found I was constantly wanting to write about my family and the past and where I've come from and how that comes into my life today. So the poem at the beginning of the book there's a line in here which I didn't think about when I put it in. I put it in because a lot of the book has a dedication to my father, quality about it, because my father died years ago, and I like to keep him alive in my writing and my thinking. I think that this sort of idea that he is alive, he's my brother's smile, my wife, my arms around my wife, it's like the love that has come to me is what I hope can come from me. There's one of my favorite stories in here about my father is what I would like to close by reading, because it just was a reminder to me that sometimes you can take those things for granted. This is a story of when I was a small boy. I thought that I really wanted a prize in school. I really wanted the school to award me a prize. This is sort of about the disappointment and then the redemption, or whatever you might want to call it, of what ultimately happened. It was written in September of 2005. As children return to school with a mixture of hope, trepidation, resignation, and resentment, my mind drifts back to Oxford in 1963. I was 11 when I saw my first prize day. I had been at Salesian College for Boys for about 2 weeks when it came around. All the boys in uniform and all the parents in their best suits gathered in the town centre and filed into the grand hallway of Oxford University, where the event was being held. I sat up on the balcony with all the other first-year boys and our parents. The older boys sat down in the main auditorium, from which they could easily walk up to the stage to receive the prizes that they were being awarded for their previous year's achievements. I watched with envy as one boy after another went up to the podium, shook hands with Father Archer, the headmaster, and proudly accepted the mysterious small parcel which had lain on the table awaiting him. I knew I could be eligible to be down there next year. Dad had often told us about the prize he won in 1933. It was a special prize created just for Dad. Nobby Barry was the dean, he used to tell us as he combed our hair. He was a dapper little chap. He would often tell the other boys to follow the example of Dad's appearance. Dad was proud of his well-shone shoes, his jet black hair, his manicured hands. But on prize day it was a complete surprise when they announced the new prize. The Dean's Prize for Deportment to Richard Leahy. I studied hard in my first year at the new school, and at the end of each term I finished second in my class. I knew that prizes were given to the top 3 boys. I looked forward to prize day all summer. That was the summer that we moved to Bournemouth. My parents bought a little corner shop and we were trying to start a new life there. In September 1964 I started at my new school, but I was determined to go back to Oxford for prize day. Dad had taken me to see Father Archer so that we could find out when it was to take place, and I could come back and receive my reward. He wasn't there, but one of the other priests told us they had not decided on a date yet. When we didn't hear anything, I wrote to the headmaster to remind him. I really wanted to attend the ceremony, but if I could not be there, I at least wanted my prize sent to me. I didn't hear from him. It was Christmas when we went back to Oxford for the first time. Things weren't going well at the shop, but Mum and Dad didn't want to tell Gran and Grandad how bad it was, so we pretended we were happy there. I didn't like the new school as much. I hadn't really made any friends, and I had finished 17th at the end of my first term there. On Boxing Day, I went over to see my friend Garvin. At the time, I was too embarrassed to ask him, but eventually, I found a way to pose the question. Whatever happened about prize day? He looked a little sheepish at first, and then pulled down a thin, hardbound copy from the bookcase, an abridged version of Moby Dick. At first I thought perhaps he was going to present it to me, that he'd been holding it for me. I opened it up and read his name printed on the inside of the cover. He had finished fifth in class, but since 2 boys ahead of him had left, they forfeited their prizes, and he moved up to 3rd. I hid my disappointment. A few weeks later, on a cold night in January, we were in the living room at the back of the shop when Dad told me he had something for me. I had just finished my homework. "This came for you today." He handed me a thick brown envelope with my name and address written on it, but no stamp. I opened it curiously, not really noticing the smile on his face. I pulled out a heavy, hardbound copy with a red dust jacket, the Oxford Shakespeare Complete Works. I turned to the first page and read the inscription. To James Leahy, to mark his splendid achievements in the first year at Salesian College, Cowley, Oxford, 1963 to 1964. How did this come? I asked doubtfully. Dad smiled. He said they couldn't deny me it now. I had earned the prize. I looked at the inscription again, and then I realized. But this is your handwriting, Dad. He tried to think of something to say, but I didn't need him to pretend. I missed having my fleeting moment of pride on prize day, and I was still upset that the school would just forget about me. But 40 years later, the Oxford Shakespeare has a special place on the bookshelf in my study. Today, as I turn to Sonnet 29, I read the words of the bard. Love remembered such wealth brings, that then I scorn to change my state with kings. That's it.
Does anybody have any questions for Jim?
Did you write when you were still living in England?
Not really, no. The process of being a writer, I mean, I used to enjoy writing. I used to enjoy writing a letter. Not when I was very young. I had to be prodded into it. I didn't like to read, I didn't like to write when I was, even through my teen years. And somehow, what happened to me was, the one thing I was good at in school was the German language. And so I went to study German because I thought it was the only thing I had any success at. And I started enjoying German literature. And I have a feeling that an appreciation for a foreign language brought me back to an appreciation of my own. I didn't read much of my own language until I had graduated college. I was studying German and history, so I was reading history, I was reading literature, German literature. And discovering the whole wealth of English literature at a later age probably was beneficial. I wasn't having it thrust upon me too hard. And I just found that certain writers had ways of writing and expressing things that caught my imagination.
Question. Jim, can you talk about your process as you go through a column or as you're writing a piece? Do you start with a kernel of an idea, or do you have the whole thing, or how does it go?
Yeah, I'm always curious about what people's process is writing, because I don't know how many people do it the way I do, but I like the way I do it. It works for me. When I want to write something, I think about it for a few weeks, usually. Sometimes I don't have that opportunity because I think of something and I know that it's going to cease to be timely if I'm trying to write about Easter and I get the idea on a week before Easter. I don't have much time, but it works best for me when some kernel of an idea starts to come to me and I carry it around in my mind and I think about it off and on in the course of my day, and I sort of have just a feel. I would say a feel for what I want to say, a feel for where I'm going. I don't always know where I'm going with it. I kind of find I know where I want to begin, and I know generally what it is I want to say, and I have a lot of ideas. And eventually, it feels ripe enough to sit down in front of the computer, and it takes me about an hour or two, that I usually find that once I have that feeling of ripeness, then it flows, and I feel that gives my writing the quality of a flow. I think other people get that quality by a lot of hard work. People who write with incredible fluidity have actually labored over it and disguised very well how much work actually goes into it. For me, the work is in sort of the thinking, that once I get to the writing, it comes out more or less as it is, and I don't find that I can play with it a lot. The more I play with it, the more I'm likely to ruin it.
When you were writing about people, were they people you already knew, or were they people that you wanted to learn about and interviewed?
Yeah, what happened with that was I wrote an article. I wrote an article about independent stores. As it happened, also, I picked stores in Concord, including the Concord bookshop, as it happened just by chance, as stores that I felt represented sort of a small town businesses. And then shortly after that, I decided that I was working at Spice and Grain on Thoreau Street at the time, that Thoreau Street was an overlooked area of town, that if you looked in the paper, or just sort of got the mentality of the town, there was a tendency to think there's West Concord and there's Concord. And Thoreau Street sort of was a no man's land. And because some of the bigger stores, the supermarkets that were in that area had sort of vacated, it was feeling like, hey, somebody needs to talk this up a little. So I decided, in order to make an interesting article about that, and not just repeat the one I'd just done about independent stores, I went round and I talked to everybody in a business and wrote a little history of the businesses in Thoreau Street. And that process was so interesting to me that I thought, oh, everybody has an interesting story. So I thought, I bet I could talk to interesting just people in town. And I started off with people I knew. I started off with Tom and Edith Sisson, who make honey and have chickens, and they used to bring eggs to the store. And they were interesting people who lived in town, who lived actually a life that I think it almost could belong in this book. I'd thought hard about putting it in here, but it sort of had become rather dated by then. And then I wrote another one about somebody I knew, and what started happening is people would come into the store, people I didn't know, and say, you should write about so-and-so, and you should write about so-and-so. So I started getting lists of people. And what stopped me doing it was it just became too time-consuming, because I couldn't just write. I had to go and interview people and then write and then go back and talk to them again, because I always wanted to check with them that I wasn't misrepresenting them. And I found that it was more time-consuming than I was able to do. And I didn't think I made as good an interviewer as some other people. That I got off to a good start, but I found I was not feeling as capable of doing it, and it was taking a lot of time, and I was beginning to find my own voice anyway and having fun expressing my own thoughts.
The American authors of, say, the 1850s and so forth, any of those resonate with you, would affect your writing?
You know, I haven't. No, the American authors who have resonated with me most are more modern ones. But Wendell Berry particularly, and Wallace Stegner as a modern author. The Concord authors, for some reason, living in Concord and with an interest in literature, I have never quite gone down that path.
Do you think you're always going to feel as if you have one foot in the English countryside and one foot here? That the Atlantic is a big, wide space.
Yeah, I think there was a phrase I used in one of the stories here that sort of I thought I was trying to express how do I feel, and it's like I'm like I can't remember how I used it now. I've naturalized. I'm like a plant that's naturalized here, but I still bear the traits of my heredity.
What brought you to the U.S.? There's a lot of longing for Britain in your books, so I wonder why you came and how come you never went back?
The confusion of youth. The confusion of being a German graduate without an obvious career path. And I traveled to Germany, and then I worked on a farm in Norway, and then I came here for a visit, and I sort of found my life here when I wasn't really looking for it. It was just I didn't have any kind of sense of direction that I clearly understood. But I came here and I found the work that I enjoy and the wife that I love and the family that have become my family.
One more question?
Do you write, or do you plan to write poetry and novels and things like that? Other media?
well, I don't know whether you'd call it poetry. I write comic verse, yes, a few people know me for that, and I've written children's verse. So I have actually thought next about maybe doing something with the children's verse. The comic verse that I write is very particular for groups of people, and therefore could never be marketed to the wider public because it's all jokes that only those people for whom they're written understand. But the children's verse I am thinking about as perhaps the next project.
Well, we'd like to thank Jim very much for coming. We have his book here for sale, and I'm sure he'll stay and sign it for you if you wish. Next week, next Saturday, we're having a book fair for Gaining Ground, which distributes 20,000 pounds of organic fruits and vegetables every year. And then on March 16th, we're having Sarah Lashever, who's also local, and she'll be discussing her book, Ask For It, How Women Can Use the Power of Negotiation to Get What They Really Want. So once again, thank you very much for coming to the bookshop this afternoon.